From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I personally see a society that respects the integrity of its citizens, to struggle with complex health issues, and make decisions that are appropriate for them and their personal lives. I see a society that respects the religious differences of its citizens. I see a society that rejects hate.
The anniversary of an assassination. 3 years ago today, abortion provider Dr. George Tiller was shot dead while attending church in Wichita, Kansas. Reproductive health care providers remain the target of violence amidst a wave of new legislation curtailing access to safe abortions. Last week, 2 clinics in Georgia and a women's organization in New Orleans were set ablaze. We'll speak with Vicky Saporta of the National Abortion Federation and abortion provider Dr. Willie Parker. Then to Bahrain to speak with 2 just-released political prisoners, Zainab Akwaja and Nabil Rajab. They were both jailed for protesting the U.S.-backed monarchy.
I'm going to continue my struggle, no matter how much they're going to cost me, no matter how many days they're going to put me, and how many months and how many years. I believe that's the cost of the struggle, that's the cost of the freedom that we are fighting for, and I'm willing to pay that cost.
Then Haiti's first gold rush since the days of Christopher Columbus. U.S. and Canadian mining companies are hoping to strike it rich in the hemisphere's poorest country. But will the people of Haiti benefit? We'll speak with reporter Jane Regan. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. New fightings erupted in Yemen as part of a government offensive on al-Qaeda militants in the country's south. 7 people were killed earlier today when fighters attacked a town held by government troops. The clashes came hours after some 20 fighters and 7 soldiers exchanged fire on the outskirts of Jar. The ongoing fighting in Yemen comes amidst a major food crisis, with some 5 million people undernourished, 300,000 children facing life-threatening malnutrition. Syrian rebels have issued a 48-hour deadline for the regime of President Bashar al-Assad to comply with an international peace plan or face renewed fighting. The Free Syrian Army says it will give Assad's forces until early Friday morning to adhere to the agreement brokered by international envoy Kofi Annan. Speaking in Turkey, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon said Syria is at risk of a full-scale civil war.
The Joint Special Envoy, Mr. Kofi Annan, has expressed his concerns that we may have reached a tipping point in Syria, that the massacre of civilians of the sort seen last weekend could plunge Syria into a catastrophic civil war, a civil war from which the country would never recover. I demand that the government of Syria act on its commitment under the Annan peace plan.
In the latest violence reported in Syria, UN observers say 13 bodies have been discovered in an eastern area with their hands tied behind their backs. Syrian forces, meanwhile, continue to bomb the rebel-held area of Homs. At the United Nations, U.S. envoy Susan Rice in Syria faces unspecified consequences should it continue to flout the Annan peace plan.
Members of this council and members of the international community are left with the option only of having to consider whether they're prepared to take actions outside of the Annan plan and the authority of this council. That scenario, obviously, is the one we all have sought to avoid through support for the Annan plan. The decision rests in the first instance with the Syrian government.
The Assad regime has faced growing international pressure following the massacre of over 100 people in Hula last week. On Wednesday, Turkey became the latest country to expel a Syrian diplomat, joining with 12 others. Also speaking at the United Nations, Syrian envoy Bashar Jafri denied government responsibility for the killings in Hula. In Iraq, at least 13 people have died in a series of bombings in Baghdad. The deadliest attack occurred when a parked car exploded outside a crowded restaurant, killing 10 people and wounding 25 others. New figures show civilian deaths in Afghanistan are showing at least a temporary decline for the first time in 5 years. According to the UN, killings of civilians dropped 21% in the first 4 months of the year. Last year was the deadliest on record for civilians in the more than decade-long Afghan war. Reports have emerged in that a Pakistani doctor sentenced to 33 years in prison after helping to track down Osama bin Laden was actually convicted of colluding with an Islamist warlord, not evading the CIA. The news comes after U.S. lawmakers voted to cut $33 million in aid to Pakistan in response to Shakil Afridi's sentence. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had also condemned his conviction. Afridi had worked with the CIA to set up a fake vaccination program to help locate bin Laden, but a Pakistani court reportedly declined to examine Afridi's CIA ties, instead focusing on his connection to a warlord whose fighters are battling the Pakistani army. Hundreds of Tibetans have reportedly been detained opposing Chinese rule in Tibet's capital of Lhasa. The protests broke out after 2 people set themselves on fire in protest of China earlier this week. It was said to be the first major act of protest against Chinese control in 4 years. In election news, Florida Governor Rick Scott is moving forward with a plan to purge thousands of people from the voting rolls in a state that could be a key battleground in the November election. While the move is ostensibly aimed at cracking down on non-citizens, critics say the process has relied on outdated information and has swept up hundreds of eligible citizen voters. Already, citizens have begun receiving letters identifying them as possible non-citizens and requiring them to provide proof of citizenship in order to vote. An analysis by the Miami Herald found Hispanic, Democratic, and independent-minded voters are most likely to be targeted in the purge. The news follows a wave of voter ID laws passed in multiple states as part of what some see as a bid to disenfranchise Democratic voters ahead of the election. On Wednesday, Attorney General Eric Holder discussed the attack on voting rights in an address to African-American lawmakers and church leaders in Washington.
Despite our nation's long tradition of extending voting rights to non-property owners and to women, to people of color, to Native Americans, and to younger Americans, today, a growing number of our fellow citizens are worried about the same disparities, divisions, and problems that nearly 5 decades ago so many sought to address. In my travels across this country, I've heard a consistent drumbeat of concern from citizens who, often for the first time in their lives, now have reason to believe that we are failing to live up to one of our nation's most noble ideals, and that some of the achievements that define the civil rights movement now hang again in the balance.
A new analysis has found most major companies that have publicly expressed concern about climate change have privately contradicted that stance by donating money to candidates opposed to environmentally friendly policies. The Union of Concerned Scientists found half of the 28 companies studied had misrepresented climate science in their public communications, despite taking public stances against global warming. Less than a third of the companies supported science-based climate policy through their donations, while the rest supported candidates opposed to such policies. 9 couples in Illinois have filed suit to challenge the state's ban on same-sex marriage. The suit was filed 1 year to the day after Illinois enacted civil unions for same-sex couples, but continued to deprive them of the full recognitions and protections of marriage. The White House has apologized to Poland over language used by President Obama in honoring Polish resistance fighter Jan Karski earlier this week. Obama referred to a, quote, Polish death camp without noting Poland was occupied by Nazi Germany. On Wednesday, White House Press Secretary Jay Carney said Obama misspoke.
The president misspoke. He was referring to Nazi death camps in German-occupied Poland. And as we've made clear, we regret the misstatement. And that simple misstatement should not at all detract from the clear intention to honor Mr. Karski, and beyond that, all those brave Polish citizens who stood on the side of human dignity in the face of tyranny.
Jan Karski, the Polish diplomat, visited the Warsaw Ghetto and got word out, came to the United States, visited U.S. officials, including the Supreme Court Justice Frankfurter, to talk about what he saw. Thousands of people marched in cities across Canada Wednesday night in an act of solidarity with the Quebec student protests. Demonstrators banged pots and pans as they walked through the streets in a nod to the so-called casserole protests that have erupted in Quebec since the provincial government imposed an emergency law barring unauthorized demonstrations. And video of an Illinois Republican legislator launching an angry tirade on the floor of the Illinois General Assembly is making the rounds on the Internet. The lawmaker, Mike Bost, exploded in a speech denouncing what he called the excessive power of Illinois House Leader Mike Madigan, a Democrat.
Again, total power in one person's hands, not the American way. These damn bills that come out here all the damn time, come out here at the last second, and I gotta try to figure out how to vote for my people. How ashamed are you? Should be. You should be ashamed of yourselves. I'm sick of it. Every year, we give power to one person. It was not made that way in the Constitution. He was around when it was written. Now we pass rules that stop each one of us. Enough! I feel like somebody trying to be released from Egypt. Let my people go!
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.